The year is 1789. France is in chaos. The king is clueless. The people are starving. And somewhere in the middle of all this, an angry mob is about to turn the world upside down. How did we get here? And more importantly, how does a revolution actually start? Get ready, because this one has it all. Political drama, economic collapse, and a whole lot of people screaming in French. France, in the late 18th century, a land of powdered wigs, overpriced pastries, and economic policies so bad they make modern government spending look responsible. For years, the country had been digging itself into a financial grave, and by 1789, they finally hit rock bottom. The treasury was empty, the poor were being taxed to death, and the nobility was too busy flexing their wealth to care. But this financial disaster didn't just appear out of nowhere. Let's take a closer look at how France managed to bankrupt itself into a revolution. First, let's talk about war. Because if there's one thing that can drain a country's wallet faster than a shopaholic in Paris, it's war. France had been involved in so many conflicts that they might as well have put fighting everyone on their national resume as a hobby. The 7 Years' War, from 1756 to 1763, had already left France, bruised and battered, both financially and militarily. Then came the American Revolution, from 1775 to 1783, where France generously decided to help the American colonies fight the British. Why? Mostly out of spite. But spite can be really expensive. And by the time the war was over, France had spent so much money supporting the Americans that they might as well have just bought the colonies themselves. Meanwhile, back at home, France was running on an economic system that was, to put it politely, a disaster. The country operated under a tax structure that made absolutely no sense. The people with the most money, the nobility and the clergy, paid little to no taxes. The people with the least money, the peasants and the working class, were expected to shoulder the burden. And this wasn't just some minor inconvenience. We're talking about peasants handing over nearly half of their income to taxes, while the aristocracy was out here, throwing lavish parties where a single bottle of wine cost more than a farmer's entire yearly wage. And then there was King Louis XVI, who we'll generously call economically challenged. This guy was about as financially responsible as a teenager with their first credit card. He wasn't evil, just painfully out of touch. He meant well, but his idea of fixing things mostly involved avoiding tough decisions and hoping problems would magically solve themselves. Spoiler alert, they didn't. His advisors, recognizing that the country was on the verge of complete financial collapse, suggested the unthinkable: taxing the nobles. This was met with a kind of outrage you'd expect if someone tried to ban wine in France. The nobility wasn't about to start paying taxes just because the country was on the brink of ruin. That was the peasant's job after all. But don't worry, Louis had a plan. And by plan, I mean he had absolutely no plan. So, like any desperate ruler, he decided to call in the Estates General, a political body that hadn't met in 175 years. Think of it like digging up an ancient, half-rotten manual to fix your Wi-Fi. Except, instead of tech support, you get a revolution. The Estates General was supposed to be a way to address France's financial crisis, but instead, it just put the country's class tensions on full display. Alright, quick breakdown of French society. The First Estate. The clergy, wealthy, powerful, and mostly tax-free. They controlled massive amounts of land and held a tight grip on religious and moral authority. While some lower-ranking clergy members sympathized with the common people, the higher-ups were more concerned with maintaining their privileged status. The Second Estate. The nobility, also wealthy, also powerful, also tax-free. These were the people living in extravagant mansions, attending endless banquets, and dressing like they were permanently auditioning for a role in a historical drama. They held most of the important government and military positions, not because of their skills, but because of their bloodlines. The Third Estate. Everyone else, as in 98% of the population. And guess who paid all the taxes? Yep, you guessed it, the Third Estate. This group included everyone from wealthy merchants to struggling peasants. The vast majority of them, especially the peasants, were barely scraping by, and things were about to get worse. If you were a peasant in France, your life was a non-stop game of how much worse can this get. Spoiler alert, worse. Bread prices skyrocketed, wages stayed low, and people were selling furniture just to afford a meal. The reason? A series of poor harvests had led to food shortages, And since bread was basically the foundation of the French diet, this was a catastrophe. Can you just imagine for a second if your daily coffee suddenly costs $50? It was that bad, but with actual starvation involved. Meanwhile, Queen Marie Antoinette, forever misunderstood and forever making bad PR moves, was out here allegedly saying,
Qu'il mange de la brioche.
Let them eat cake. Which, to be fair, she probably never actually said, but when you're spending more on dresses than the national budget, people tend to make up quotes about you. Marie Antoinette wasn't deliberately evil, but she was the poster child for aristocratic excess at the worst possible time. While people were starving, she was hosting extravagant parties at Versailles, buying ridiculous outfits, and generally embodying everything the French people despised about the ruling class. As tensions rose, the Third Estate realized that the system was never going to change unless they forced it to. And so, the seeds of revolution were planted. The Estates General was supposed to be a way to fix France's problems. But instead, it became the stage for something much bigger. The Third Estate had finally had enough, and they were about to take matters into their own hands. And just like that, the countdown to the French Revolution had officially begun. So when the Estates General finally met, the Third Estate had one simple demand.
Et, peut-être arrêter de nous traiter comme des portefeuilles humains.
Hey, maybe stop treating us like human wallets. The king and nobles, not interested. It was business as usual for the privileged, and by business, I mean making sure they stayed rich and powerful while everyone else suffered. To understand why this was such a slap in the face, let's take it back a bit. France's entire political system was built like a rigged casino where the house always wins. And the house was the First and Second Estates. Sure, the Third Estate technically had representation, but representation meant nothing when voting was done by estate rather than population. That meant the First Estate voted for whatever helped the clergy. The Second Estate voted for whatever kept them rich. The Third Estate, well, they were just there to suffer and foot the bill, with 2 out of 3 votes always siding with the elites. It was like playing a game where the referee, the opponent, and the rule book were all against you. The Third Estate could have had 1 million representatives, and they still would have been outvoted by a couple hundred well-fed aristocrats. And the worst part, the king had the final say on everything anyway. This wasn't a democracy. It was a puppet show, and the Third Estate was done being the audience. At first, they tried playing nice. They proposed that voting should be done by head count rather than by estate. This would have made things fairer since they made up 98% of the population. But fairness wasn't exactly a hot commodity in pre-revolutionary France, and both the clergy and nobility immediately shot it down. Why? Because letting the majority actually have power would mean taxes for the rich and accountability for the privileged, and they weren't about to let that happen. So the Third Estate did what any reasonable group of overtaxed, underfed, and completely fed-up citizens would do.
Oubliez ça, nous créons notre propre gouvernement.
They said, forget this, we're making our own government. And just like that, the National Assembly was born. Louis XVI's reaction, a classic mix of denial and panic. At first, he ignored them, hoping they'd get tired and go home. When that didn't work, he tried ordering them to disband. That didn't work either. So finally, he did what desperate rulers do when they don't have a plan. He locked them out of their own meeting hall. But if Louis thought he could stop a revolution with a locked door, he clearly didn't understand how angry the people were. The Third Estate simply moved to a nearby indoor tennis court. Because when life closes a door, simple, you find another building. And that's exactly what they did. They took what became known as the tennis court oath. They swore that they wouldn't stop meeting until France had a real constitution. Up until now, France had been an absolute monarchy, meaning the king had total control. A constitution would limit his power and actually give people rights. In other words, it was a political equivalent of lighting a match in a room full of gunpowder. At this point, Louis had 2 choices: compromise or crack down. Naturally, he chose the worst possible option. He sent in troops. Now, deploying soldiers against your own people is never a great look, especially when those people are already angry and starving. Instead of scaring the revolutionaries into submission, it made things even worse. Rumors spread that the king was planning to use the army to dissolve the National Assembly by force. Suddenly, the revolution wasn't just about taxes and unfair representation anymore. It was about survival. Paris exploded into full-blown chaos. Crowds gathered, speeches were made, and suddenly everyone was very interested in arming themselves. But where do you find weapons in a city where the government controls the guns? Enter the Bastille. Officially, The Bastille stood as a medieval fortress. It was a prison looming over the city. Unofficially, it was a decaying fortress turned prison that housed exactly 7 prisoners, including a couple of forgers, a lunatic who thought he was Julius Caesar, and a guy who was locked up because his family asked the king to do it. Not exactly a hive of hardened criminals, but the Bastille wasn't about the prisoners. It was about what it represented. The fortress stood as a grim reminder of absolute monarchy, a place where political dissidents disappeared, and where the king's word was law, unchecked and unquestioned. And more importantly, it housed something far more useful than prisoners: gunpowder. Lots and lots of gunpowder. By the morning of July 14, 1789, Paris was a pressure cooker with the lid about to blow off. The people, already starving and furious, had been watching soldiers march through their streets for days, but unsure if the king was about to crack down on them, or just continue ignoring their suffering. A militia of revolutionaries had already raided the Hotel des Invalides, grabbing muskets. But there was one problem. They had guns, but no ammunition. And so, they turned their eyes to the Bastille. Thousands of Parisians, armed with whatever they could find, knives, clubs, and the occasional rusty musket, marched to the prison and demanded that the governor, Bernard Delaunay, hand over the gunpowder. Delaunay, who had 32 Swiss soldiers, 82 elderly guards, and no real plan, refused. He did, however, offer the crowd lunch. Yes, really. He tried to defuse the situation by inviting a few representatives inside for negotiations and giving the crowd bread and wine. It didn't work. The standoff escalated. Words turned to shouts. Shouts turned to musket fire. Before long, chaos erupted, and the Bastille, once an unshakable fortress, became the battleground for the first violent uprising of the French Revolution. For hours, the revolutionaries tried to break in, using anything they could find to breach the gates. They tried scaling the walls. They used makeshift battering rams. They even fired a small cannon at the front doors. But the Bastille was built to withstand attacks, and Delaunay's men fired back, killing nearly 100 revolutionaries. Then came the turning point. Some sympathetic soldiers, French guards who had been fed up with their commanders, arrived with proper artillery. The moment those cannons started blasting away, Delaunay realized it was over. Facing an enraged mob with no hope of reinforcements, he surrendered, but surrender didn't mean safety. The second the gates were opened, the crowd swarmed inside, ransacked the fortress, and dragged Delaunay out onto the streets. At first, they planned to march him to City Hall as a prisoner, but somewhere along the way, mob justice took over. Delaunay was beaten, stabbed, and ultimately decapitated. His head was placed on a pike and paraded through the streets like a grim trophy. The revolution had officially begun, and there was no turning back. This had a domino effect, and France was literally free-falling. Louis XVI, upon hearing the news, reportedly asked,
Est-ce une révolte?
"Is it a revolt?" To which one of his advisors replied,
Non, sire, c'est une révolution.
"No, sire, it is a revolution." And oh, was it ever. News of the Bastille's fall spread like wildfire, and with it, the realization that the people could fight back and win. And the old system, the one where the monarchy ruled without question, it was crumbling faster than a stale croissant in a fistfight. Across France, peasants heard about what had happened in Paris and thought, well, if they can do it, why can't we? What followed was the Great Fear, a wave of uprisings, where farmers and laborers torched manor houses, looted noble estates, and burned records that kept them tied to feudal obligations. Lords who didn't flee fast enough often found themselves at the mercy of their former workers. The entire countryside was on fire, both figuratively and literally. Meanwhile, King Louis XVI, who was still clueless about how serious things had become, wrote in his diary that night, "Nothing happened. Seriously, Louis, nothing happened. Didn't the citizens just tore down a symbol of your rule, executed your governor, and turned your capital into a battlefield? But sure, nothing happened, Louis." The National Assembly, now emboldened, seized the moment. Just weeks later, on August 4th, 1789, they made a radical decision. Feudalism was dead. In one night, they abolished noble privileges, erased centuries of aristocratic control, and laid the groundwork for what would eventually become modern France. But guess what? They weren't done. By October, the people had another demand: bring the king to Paris. You see, the royal family was still hiding out in Versailles, living in luxury while the people of Paris were starving, and that didn't sit well with the public. Thousands of women, many of them market workers who had lost patience with high bread prices, grabbed whatever weapons they could find. Yes, some had pitchforks and possibly a baguette or two, marched 12 miles in the rain, and stormed Versailles. The royal guards, they were no match for the mob, and soon, the palace was overrun. The crowd demanded that Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette move to Paris so they could see firsthand the suffering of their people. With no real choice, the king and queen packed their things, climbed into a carriage, and were escorted back to the city by an army of furious citizens chanting revolutionary slogans. For the monarchy, this was, literally, checkmate. The king was no longer ruling by divine right. He was now a prisoner of his own people, a mere figurehead in a revolution that was rapidly spiraling beyond his control. It was the point of no return, and by now, one thing was clear: the old order was finished. The Bastille's fall wasn't just an event, it was a symbol, a breaking point, a warning that when the people were pushed too far, they would push back hard. And the violence, this was just the beginning. Because when a nation decides to tear itself apart and rebuild from scratch, there's always one question left: who gets to decide what comes next? And let's just say that for the revolutionaries, the answer involved a lot of guillotines. So, what's next? If you think the storming of the Bastille was wild, wait until you see what happens when revolutionaries start pointing fingers at each other. The reign of terror is coming, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. For more insane history, like, leave a comment, and subscribe for more, because we're just getting started.